What I'm going to talk about today, as Luke has outlined, and indeed the title highlights, is the representation of the Crusades in strategy computer games. And this ties in with the forthcoming volume, Playing the Crusades, which is scheduled for release on the 16th of March. And indeed, what I'm going to be talking about today ties in very strongly with a lot of the material that I talk about within my chapter within this volume. There's also, as you can see, there's a fairly substantial range of topics covered within the volume, and indeed there are a number of authors who have written much more interesting things than I have. So please do check out their works, whether within this volume or elsewhere. And this all ties in with my broader work at the moment. So what I'm researching, what I'm currently writing a monograph about, and indeed what informs a lot of my current teaching about the Middle Ages and computer games, is what drives the depictions of the Middle Ages within these games. And my core theory at the moment, my core principle, thesis, whichever you prefer, is that the representation of the Middle Ages in computer games is a combination, a confluence of medievalist and gaming tropes. And ultimately, well, I'm sure all of you are well aware of many of these tropes. So within medievalist tropes, these things like knights in shining armor, dirty peasants, an all-powerful, all-seeing church, backward superstition, all-powerful kings, a very, very white Middle Ages, all of these sorts of tropes. And these meet a whole range of gaming tropes, ranging from issues around balance, progression, and victory, issues around a focus around violence, again, a focus around white, male, and straight characters, and perhaps a sidelining of religion and other aspects of society. And ultimately, I contend that the combination of these two sets of tropes leads to a new vision of the Middle Ages within this particular media format. And while many of these tropes, they exaggerate each other, in particular, for example, we see a very exaggerated vision of violence within the Middle Ages, within computer games set in and around the period. But in other respects, the combination of these two sets of tropes leads to a new depiction, often in unexpected and sometimes interesting ways. And what I'm going to talk about today is how this manifests within games about the Crusades, or games which represent some aspects of the Crusades. Because, as I'm sure many of you will no doubt agree, the Crusades has provided a lot of fodder for the production of computer games relating to the Middle Ages. Indeed, it seems to be pretty much ubiquitous across games set in the period, whether as a setting or a game mechanic. And today I'm going to focus in particular on strategy games. So games like the Civilization series, Medieval Total War series, and indeed Crusader Kings from Paradox Interactive. And these sorts of games that put you in the role of a medieval ruler. A player with a vast amount of control over every aspect of the military, economy, and political life of your nation, of your kingdom. And of course, there are various advantages with using these games as tools for exploring history, whether inside the classroom or outside the classroom. See various strengths in how these games can explore global history or environmental history, for example. At the same time, we see a substantial number of limitations to these representations, including a particularly worrying trend towards representations of imperialism, colonialism, and Eurocentrism as the only valid forms of civilizational development, as these games very frequently cast it. And what I'm going to talk about today then, basically 4 key points. So first of all, I want to look at the way the nature of games combines with popular perceptions of the Crusades and the Middle Ages in general to influence these games' representations of, first of all, the causes of the Crusades, so what sparked the Crusades. Secondly, the game's representations of the participants on these crusades, so who actually went on crusade, and thirdly, of the objectives of the crusades as portrayed within games. And I'm going to highlight a few of the underlying issues, underlying problems with with these representations, and I'm going to suggest a few potential solutions at the very end of this presentation, leaning fairly heavily on the downloadable content Holy Fury for Crusader Kings 2 and the successor game Crusader Kings 3. So, part one then, the causes of the Crusades. I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that the causes of the Crusades were complex. However, as far as I can tell, this is never really represented within strategy games. And in fact, most of these games, most, if not all of these games, in fact, present the Crusades as something that's inevitable, something that will happen at some point during the progression through history. So in the case of Civilization 2, for example, the first Civilization game to give any sort of representation to the Crusades, the Crusades essentially happen when a player researches monotheism and gains access to the military unit Crusaders. It's as simple as that. Slightly more complex, we see in the second of the medieval Total War games. After a couple of dozen years, a couple of dozen turns of play, the Pope will call a crusade, typically for Jerusalem, but occasionally for any other city within the Holy Land. The Crusades are presented as being inevitable. It doesn't matter what the player does, they will happen one way or another. And this is perhaps a little bit surprising, given the non-linear nature of these games. The strategy games, they're hugely open-ended. And we can see an example on the screen I've got pulled up here. This is a shot from a couple of hundred years into a game of Crusader Kings 2. And as you can see, well, the Kingdom of England is very much reduced at this point. It's been conquered in large part by the Kingdom of Ireland, in somewhat smaller part by the Holy Roman Empire, but also there's a large rebellion going on under the Duke of Kent. What this means for these games, though, is that, well, any game that starts more than a couple of dozen years, a decade or two before the start of the Crusades, will struggle to explain why the Crusades start in the first place. Taking a game like Crusader Kings, which allows the player to start all the way back in the 8th century, it's very hard to it's very hard to guarantee that a geopolitical situation will exist as we approach the year 1100, in which the start of the Crusades makes sense. There's no way of guaranteeing that Jerusalem will be in Muslim hands. There's no way of guaranteeing that the systems of church reform, the focus on the truth of God, the peace of God, the control of violence on the part of the church will have taken place. There's no way of guaranteeing that a conflict between the German Emperor and the Pope will have taken place, perhaps it's sparking renewed interest in the control of violence on the part of the Pope. As a result of this, it's very hard for game developers to adequately prepare a nuanced explanation for the start of the Crusades. And in many cases, indeed, I think in all cases, the Crusades have to be introduced as an arbitrary construct. It's having these very arbitrary causes. They will happen inevitably, typically sometime in the 11th century. And this situation isn't helped by the fact that these games tend towards a very abstract representation of religion. So here's the founder religion screen from Civilization 5. And as you can see, the player has some degree of choice as to which benefits, which drawbacks the chosen religion will grant them. But game developers in general tend to shy away from any sort of detailed representation of any modern religion. And to a certain extent, this makes perfect sense. This is very often a turn-off for their players, and it can very often lead to potential controversy within the player base and within the population more broadly. Nobody wants to have a game. No one wants to have a game facing a satanic panic, as we saw with Dungeons and Dragons several decades ago. And this abstract representation of religion means, by extension, any representation of the Crusades must be fairly abstract. Any representation of their causes, the complex reasons behind the outbreak of the Crusades, has to be very abstract. And beyond this, we have to consider the resources required to adequately program the Crusades. Because even with all these abstractions, the Crusades are a fairly complex series of events for game developers to construct. They have to come up with a series of mechanics to justify why the player should suddenly want to go and invade provinces on the far side of the map. And if these resources have been devoted to developing Crusades in this manner, then the developers are likely to want the players to experience these mechanics in at least the majority of playthroughs. As a result, the Crusades need to be represented as something that will inevitably happen, or will almost inevitably happen. Otherwise, the player will miss out on a large part of the resources expended by the developers in the company. And ultimately, this ties into some player expectations about the Crusades. And the idea that the Crusades were to an extent an inevitable clash of civilizations based around Christianity and Islam. And this is a fairly common medievalist trope, but perhaps it's unsurprising to find it represented within these games. However, at the same time, by representing the Crusades as these inevitable, very simple events, game developers contribute to the propagation of this very simple view of an inevitable clash of civilizations between the Muslim and Christian worlds. So that's the first issue investigated then, really. So we've seen that there are various different reasons why computer games computer games and strategy games tend towards a very abstract approach towards the causes of the Crusades. And I'd like to move on now and talk about these games and their representation of the participants on the Crusades. And again, I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that the participants within, the makeup of the participants within the Crusades was complex. We see people from every walk of life, almost every walk of life, participating on these Crusades, from kings and emperors down to lowly peasants. Once again, though, the representation of the participants, and in particular the leaders of the Crusades, are typically presented in a very simplistic manner within strategy games. And in fact, the vast majority of these games, they tend to present the Crusades and Crusaders as being dominated by royal crusaders, figures like King Richard, like Philip Augustus, like Frederick Barbarossa. And again, this is something that makes perfect sense in terms of the tropes surrounding these games. So many of these strategy games, they still make use of these totemic rulers. So civilization is perhaps the original example of this. With a game spanning over 6,000 years, the player controls a single tribe, a single civilization throughout this period, but they do so through the avatar of this one figure closely associated with the particular civilization. We've seen a few experiments with a somewhat more complex approach, where a player will play through a series of individual rulers, very often forming a dynasty within the Middle Ages. So this example from Medieval Total War allows the player to play as a series of figures from, well, in this case, the Norman family tree, with rulership passing from father to son throughout the period. But nevertheless, within the vast majority of these games, the player plays as a nation. They play as one particular political unit, and ultimately, they're not playing as an individual character. And this has several consequences. It means that the only figures represented within the games are the rulers of these kingdoms, the rulers of these nations. And this leads to a very flat representation of the period, and which, to be fair, is to a large extent necessary, the Middle Ages were a complex place. The social structures within the various kingdoms and so forth were complicated, and the programming of the resources required to adequately program and represent these dynasties and indeed the lower levels of medieval society are perhaps impossible to simulate within the budgets of many games, or perhaps unimportant. But this ties in with a couple of player expectations about the period to create a couple of more sinister tropes about the Crusades. So players are introduced to the period through these games as one where kings are the only important characters, and this ties in with a additional trope of the perspective of kings as warriors. And this is something we see across representations of the Middle Ages through all forms of media. Kings are typically presented with full armour, with swords, shields, and so forth. As such, this helps to emphasise the representation of the kings as military leaders within the Crusades. Of course, it makes sense for these kings to take part as leaders of the Crusades because they're the ones going around leading troops into battle right the way through the period anyway, at least according to popular conceptions of the period. But when this interacts with another trope, another medievalist trope, it leads to a bit more of a serious implication about the Crusades through these games. And this is the notion that kings are heroes. This is something that rests very heavily on Arthurian romances and the various fantasy and fiction works which have evolved out of these. But when this is combined with this representation of kings as warriors and kings as hence the leaders of the Crusades, we're left with the notion that the Crusades are an essentially heroic endeavour. There's this almighty warrior, this ruler of a kingdom, going off to fight in this great glorious war, because he is a hero. And this is perhaps a little bit more abstract, it's perhaps a little bit more implicit than some of the other materials I've been talking about today. But it's nevertheless an important consideration when addressing the Crusades in strategy games. Okay. I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that the objectives of the Crusaders were complex. But again, within strategy games, these objectives are very often simplified, or these objectives are simplified, often to the point of absurdity. And in particular, within almost every strategy game, the purpose of the Crusades is primarily that of conquest. It's of gaining additional territory for your dynasty, for your country, for your nation. And obviously this does not tie in with what we know of the motivations behind Crusaders. So yes, certainly some Crusaders set off to acquire lands, territories for themselves within the Holy Land, or indeed anywhere else where Crusades occurred. But we know that many other Crusaders had no intention of doing this. They may have crusaded for financial reasons, may have crusaded out of piety, or because their lord was off on crusade. Within the games, though, conquest is the primary, if not only, purpose behind the Crusades. And to a great extent, this is driven by the common notion within strategy games that players are conquerors. So this goes all the way back to the first civilization games, whereby the most typical way to win the game was by conquering the world. These games have developed somewhat since then. We've seen more complex objectives available to the players, but it nevertheless almost inevitably remains the case that military conquest, often of the entire world, is not only one of the possible outcomes, one of the possible goals of the game, but is the easiest, almost obvious of these goals. As a result, I've seen elsewhere in my research that even within games which don't have conquest as an objective, players will very often take to painting the map their colour. They'll take to world conquest simply because that's what they expect from this genre of game. As a result, it makes perfect sense from a design perspective that the Crusades should primarily be about conquest. And indeed, this is something we see within one of the names given to the strategy genre. 4X games explore exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination. This is a term first coined in relation to Master of Orion, but which applies very well to games set throughout the historical period with anything to do with this strategy genre. And this is problematic from a representational point of view in any case, but it becomes particularly so in conjunction with this focus on kings as rulers and as leaders of the Crusades. So in combination with this, the combination of these two tropes, they lead to a representation of the Crusades as wholly imperialist and colonialist ventures. And certainly, there are a number of similarities between the Crusades and later colonial movements, and certainly the Crusaders committed a number of atrocities in the same way as later colonial rule would. But there are several issues with conflating the two, and indeed these have been seized upon. This conflation has been seized upon by extremists all across the political scale as an excuse for far-right propaganda, or counter to this as an excuse for Islamic terrorism. So there are a number of issues then associated with the representation of the Crusades within strategy computer games. And I appreciate in many ways I've barely scratched the surface here. But what I'd like to do in the last brief 5 minutes or so of this presentation is to talk about some of the solutions, some of the steps towards resolving these issues. And I should underline that I think we're a fair way off from any game adequately representing the Crusades in a mature and sufficiently nuanced manner. But I do think that Crusader Kings 2 and indeed Crusader Kings 3 have started to get a little bit closer to that. And the developers have done this in several ways. So first of all, Crusader Kings makes use of dynamic crusades to a point. So the crusades won't necessarily happen. They're almost certainly going to happen, but they require the pre-existence of a number of triggers in order for them to be called. Essentially, at various points within the game, if a number of holy cities are outside of Christian hands, then the Pope will call a crusade to reclaim one of these cities, one of these provinces within the game. Typically, this will default to being a crusade to Jerusalem as we get towards the end of the 11th century, but it could equally be a crusade to reclaim Constantinople if the city's fallen to the Seljuk Turks earlier, for example, or even a crusade to Rome, Cologne, to Paris, to any number of places across Europe. So there's been a little bit of a thought gone into whether the Crusades should happen at all and what sparked the Crusades. This is still a very flat model for the causes behind the Crusades, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Crusader Kings also makes use of a fairly complex vision of society. So those of you who've played the game will be aware that there's been a model created of a rudimentary feudal pyramid, which allows play not only as a king or as an emperor, but as various figures further down the social scale, going down through dukes to counts and so forth. And as a result, it's possible to launch a crusade or lead a crusade as one of these lesser figures. So events like the First Crusade or the Fourth Crusade are actually possible within the game. Again, it's a fairly rudimentary system. It's still pretty limited, and there's a tendency for crusades to be dominated by kings rather than dukes. But it's nevertheless, I feel, a step in the right direction. The Crusades are also presented with more nuanced objectives within the game. They're no longer necessarily all about conquest. Players gain additional rewards for participating in the Crusades. They gain a share of the war chest. Their characters will pick up beneficial traits from participating in the Crusades. They'll be awarded with piety, which will improve relations with the papacy and indeed with more or less any pious Christian character. Again, still some limitations here, but steps in the right direction. And through Crusader Kings 3 in particular, we've started to see an emergence of role play around the Crusades. And this is a particular example of this. This is in response to the call to the First Crusade, the response of a cynical character in this case, on hearing that the Pope has called all good Christians to go and save Jerusalem. The response is, if the Pope says so. He's a cynical character. He doesn't believe in God, and this is the start of a number of event chains based around the personalities of different characters interacting with the Crusades in different ways. And finally, Crusader Kings 3 in particular allows a bit more of a nuance, a bit more of an interesting representation of the Crusades, because the game has expanded its focus beyond warfare. You can focus on diplomacy, on intrigue, on stewardship, or on piety and learning. So military action is always an option, and indeed it still remains the primary option for most players, but there are at least different opportunities, different ways of approaching the game and indeed the Crusades available to the player. Ultimately though, I think if we're looking for a game which can adequately represent the complexities of the Crusades, which would be useful from an educational or academic perspective, then I think we're ultimately looking for a game which incorporates the Crusades from the ground up, because the representations of the Crusades in most of these strategy games, they're something of an afterthought. They fit into the core mechanics, often in interesting ways, but ultimately they have to be made to fit into the model that the developers have created for Western Europe or a broader portion of the world within the Middle Ages or a longer period. So, to wrap everything up then, the Crusades are complicated, and their representation within strategy games is overly simplistic. This is going to causes some issues for us within the classroom, because our students will have been many of our students will have been playing these games, and they'll have been picking up a lot of their ideas about the medieval period and about the Crusades from these games. More broadly, these games can have a huge impact on their players outside the classroom, on the general public as well as our students. As a result, we need to be aware of what these influences are and where ultimately they're coming from. And at that point, we can start feeding back into the design of these games and perhaps developing games which would be more useful for us for teaching and for other purposes. So thank you all very much. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert, for the fantastic talk. A lot of food for thought. I was thinking, I have several questions myself, but it's probably better if I see if others want to ask questions. Now, before you ask questions, remember that we are recording this session. Perhaps while actually our audience, let's see if they have already written it down. So please, if you want to ask a question, write a question in the chat box, and I can read it then aloud to Rob. While you think about that, perhaps I can ask some of the questions that I was thinking about while Rob was speaking. The first one, sorry, there are so many, but the first one is how do the Crusades compare to other medieval developments and events? I mean, of course, the first one I thought about was 𝐩𝐸𝐬, which it could be said to be comparable to Crusade, but is also actually quite different under many points of view. So, but what about other events? Are there some events that in Crusader Kings or in other games happen regardless of the actions of the players, and they are equally straightforward in the way developers have designed them or included in the game. So I would contextualize a little bit this event compared to others, if you came across that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Luca. And yeah, you've hit on the elephant in the room there, and this is the representation of jihad and, well, the Muslim world in general within games set in the Middle Ages. And the truth is, it's very often an afterthought. So most games, most strategy games, most games in general, they're designed with a very much Eurocentric focus. So, for example, the first medieval Total War game, I believe they had a roster of, I think it was 19 different factions you could select. Of these, 16 were Christian, 3 were Muslim. And jihad is very often presented as just the Crusades with the serial numbers filed off. So the exact same mechanics dictate how they work. And yeah, again, the representation of jihad, the representation of Islam more generally within these games is very often an afterthought. So Crusader Kings, well, it started off as a game where you just played as a Christian ruler. That's been developed since then. The, Islamic powers have their own set of events, have their own set of mechanics, but there are a number of issues with how Islam's been represented within the game, which I suspect could fill a monograph quite happily. In terms of the Middle Ages more generally, I think the Crusades stand out as one of the trickier parts to model well. Simply because they're so unusual. So you can just about get away with your standard strategy game mechanics for representing most of the Middle Ages. So it's an array of various different powers facing off against each other across a map. And that looks so much like strategy games set in the ancient period, in the modern world, or in space in the future. There are a few tendencies within these games, particularly around technology, to spring events at certain points. So Total War, for example, there'll typically be, at some point during the game, gunpowder will be introduced, and all of a sudden you can build a new batch of units, or a new type of sailing vessel will be developed, allowing you to go and explore America. So yeah, I suppose in summary then, sorry, yeah, there are almost certainly plenty of examples of issues where there's determinism within these strategy games. It's just perhaps it stands out most starkly, for me at least, in relation to the Crusades.
Perfect, thank you. It was good to see that, to contextualize that because that was my impression as well from my old video gaming. When I was thinking about Europa Universalis, I think the same. Some events sometimes all of a sudden happen and you don't have any control of that. So on one side, one could claim that they make the game more realistic because, certain historical events really take place in the game. On the other hand, yes, you wonder how it is done, and it's strange that in games where you have so much often agency, things tend to happen regardless. In the meanwhile, I see that there have been some questions. Could you tell us more about the use of faith in Crusader Kings?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lucas. Yeah, it's a very abstract resource, basically. So you acquire faith through various methods. Typically, you'll have a background monthly gain dictated by the piety of your character, and various other modifiers depending on the state of your kingdom. You can pick up additional piety through doing pious acts. So in the case of Christians, basically paying attention to what the Pope's asking you to do, building churches, and generally being a good Christian. And you can use this piety as a way, this piety serves a practical purpose within the game. So if you've got a higher piety, for example, it's harder to be excommunicated. If you've got a high piety, then pious characters will tend to like you more. And you're also able to spend piety on, well, often certain types of buildings, on scripted events, and ultimately on, well, on creating anti-popes or influencing the targets of crusades. It's very much treated as a resource in exactly the same way as gold or, well, in Crusader Kings, prestige are used. Does that outline it sufficiently, Lucas?
I think yes. I think it does. Yes, I didn't know, and now I think I kind of understand how faith works, especially in Crusader Kings. Another question is about the crossover with other medieval themed games. Is there a point whereby the games or strategies reach beyond the individual game to gesture towards broader tropes, pan-strategic medievalism, in a sense?
Oh well, hello Andrew, and yeah, I love that. I love that phrase, and I will have to cite you on that. This is really interesting, and I've been increasingly looking towards the destruction of genre, and I think we're starting to see almost exactly what Andrew's talking about in the chat there, in terms of Crusader Kings, because obviously the game is very heavily influenced by Civilization and by these other strategy games, but it's also got a growing role-playing influences within there. I've heard Crusader Kings 3 described as a medieval Sims, basically. And I think there's a huge amount of potential here, with games taking a different approach to medieval rulership, for example. So games like The Sims Medieval, games like Mount and Blade, which are very much first-person rulership. And I think it's very interesting that these different games are starting to emerge, and I'd be very interested to hear what Andrew, well, if Andrew's identified any tropes within these games, any differences with the strategy, or the older strategy genre. Sorry, that's ended up being a counter question, hasn't it? Sorry.
No, but if Andrew can unmute himself, if you want to add something,
No, sorry, I've just seen in the chat he's gone with nope. That's your job, which is entirely fair enough. And yeah, I will get back to you on that, Andrew. Thank you.
Perfect. The next question is about games. If games exist that put the gamer not in the role of the conquerors, but in the role of the conquered, meaning the civilians and not the soldiers.
Yes, not to a substantial extent. So thank you, Antonio. It's what I've seen. I think the only game that springs to mind here immediately to me is A Plague Tale: Innocence, which, well, wherein you play as basically a pair of children in a war zone in the Middle Ages. So to a certain extent leaning on this War of Mine, which does exactly the same thing in the modern world, but without the fantastic elements. I think this would be a very interesting game, and it's one that I'd certainly be interested in playing. I suspect the reason why we don't see very many games taking this approach, this very bottom-up approach to representations of warfare, is because it's not typically seen as being something that's fun. And we've still got this hang-up that games have to be fun in a way that other media simply don't, and games simply can't deal with serious issues, which is patently not the case. And we're seeing games taking this approach. I think the recent example I can think of, The Darkest of Times, which lets you play, well, as a member of the German resistance in the build-up and course of World War II. And it's ridiculously bleak. It does nothing to glorify the resistance, and it makes their struggle seem, well, difficult to the point of pointlessness. Everything you do, even if you play exactly right, you will suffer pretty horrendous consequences. So I think there's definitely a growing market for that sort of game. I think we're increasingly demonstrating that people are ready for that kind of game, but it's hard to get buy-in, I think, Antonio.
Yes, I saw today a game called Attentat 1942, which is a World War II game through the eyes of survivors. But I'm looking right now at the website, and I was thinking, would it be possible to do something like that for the Middle Ages? Because that game from a Czech game company actually is based on the testimony of survivors, and you can hear them on the website. They're recorded. We cannot do that for the Middle Ages, especially as very often the voice of common people is quite difficult. Well, it's not impossible, but it's not. There isn't the rich material that there is available for the 20th century, because Attentat 1942 it includes interviews with the survivors, while especially for the Crusades, I was wondering to what extent can you get the experience of common people. I mean, you have evidence like the one from Margaret of Beverley, a pilgrim to the Holy Land during the Third Crusade and the aftermath, written by her. She was a commoner. She was not a member of the aristocracy and not a fighter, even if she took part in military operations such as the defense of Jerusalem. So sometimes I wonder whether something like this would be even possible.
Yeah. Well, actually, sorry, it's not quite exactly what Antonio is asking about, but it has just occurred to me that apologies. This should have been my first point of call, but as Catherine Lewis talks about in playing the Middle Ages, sorry, playing the Crusades rather. Dante's Inferno is an interesting amalgam of Dante, well, obviously Dante's Inferno, but also the events of the Third Crusade. And I think that's perhaps, well, there are various issues with the game, but I think that's perhaps a very interesting representation of the horrors of the Third Crusade, of the Crusades in general, from a first-person perspective. From the ground up, really. And I don't know if Catherine would like to say anything about that, or if I've just put her on the spot, for which I also apologise.
No, that's fine. I'd agree. I think that it's. I think that the game really does its best to highlight the horrors actually, and the impact that it has on two individual men. So no, thanks very much for the plug, Rob. And it is, I mean, in many ways, actually, it's a very, very conventional game. But if you're not familiar with it, if you go onto YouTube, you can see all of the cutscenes stitched together, and it's worth watching those cutscenes, because I think actually that there is a lot that's really interesting in the way that it plays with the Crusades and plays with crusading and masculinity as well.
Brilliant.
And both of you just gave me a splendid idea of having a round table on how to gamify Dante, because I saw there was a role-playing game. There is an Italian role-playing game being advertised at the moment, so perhaps we can, given that it is the anniversary of the death of Dante, the celebration. Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant.
So Matt is asking, where games show off the Crusades more often or not, the European Crusaders are portrayed as pious heroes. Do you believe this is detrimental to those playing the games to omit the dirty details?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I suppose the slightly longer answer is yes, absolutely. And I fully understand how it comes about. So obviously this whole hero narrative is a really useful storytelling device within games and with any other sort of media, especially with games in particular, because if you're going to put the player into the role of one of these crusaders, then you're going to want the crusader to typically be a good guy. We've set certain notable exceptions, with Dante's Inferno notwithstanding. And I think it comes, yeah, I think it comes back to games as a form of escapism. So this power fantasy where you don't have to think about your actions, which can be brilliant as a form of stress relief, but it's I feel that's more than outweighed by the longer term harm that, well, basically this understanding of the Crusaders as heroes can very easily have through these games. So yeah, absolutely agree with Matt. It is very detrimental, I think.
Thank you. I see there are many new messages. Daniel is asking, do you think that every player being a... Oh, I think I have missed one. Is the ontology of the Crusade as a conceptual entity complicated? On one hand, it seems like a thing that could be called by a range of people. Can it be abstracted outside of Christendom? And if not, what would be the prerequisites? The prerequisite be in a more open-ended game for calling one?
Right. Thanks, William. And yeah, this is hitting very neatly on one of the big restrictions with games of any sort, really. And it is that it's incredibly hard to present more than one argument within these games. So in case of historical games, more than one historical argument. And yeah, the representation of the Crusades in these games, typically they use the definition that a crusade is something that's called by the Pope against any non-Christians. And I know there are all manner of definitions of crusade floating around out there, ranging from, well, basically any holy war involving Christians on one side and non-Christians on the other, or indeed the wrong sorts of Christians on the other, to something that's much more specific. So very specifically, missions to the adventures to the Holy Land called by the Pope. And games have to pick one definition and go with it for their mechanics to work. And I suppose this is the thing. Yeah, so there's an issue of abstraction, because yeah, obviously we have holy war isn't something that's unique to Christianity. It's not unique to the Crusades. And I suppose, in answer to what William's asking here, the abstraction can either go to the point of almost absurdity, so we end up with things like like civilization, where religion is hugely abstract, and the Crusades are, well, it's something that you kind of just pick up from the game mechanics. There's no specific crusade within most versions of civilization. Or you go ridiculously specific, and you perhaps have a game set up to look solely at the Crusades. So yeah, focusing very much on the build up to the Crusades and on how they came about, and indeed what exactly was a crusade. Which I suspect lead to a very dry, but for me very interesting game. Yeah, does that just about cover it, William? Sorry.
But if you check his answer, because otherwise I lose the...
Sorry, no.
the list of the questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
Daniel...
that's grand.
Perfect. So Daniel is asking, do you think that every player being an opponent, enemy, hamstrings how the Holy War could be portrayed in games? So there is no incentive in any game not to encourage a crusade, as they either weaken opponents or the player gain direct benefits. Any moral issues boil down to a frustration that an opponent interrupts the player plans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Daniel's hit on a really important point here. And yeah, this is the idea that games are about winning, and that if you win, everybody else loses. And while yes, certainly there are some specific instances within history where it's very clear win-loss, zero-sum game. So I suppose if you want to push the Battle of Hastings or the entire events of 1066, I mean, 3 candidates for the king, 2 of them die, 1 of them becomes king. So, but more generally though, this idea that to win you have to conquer the world doesn't really meet up with, well, medieval ideals of kingship, or indeed ideals of rulership for more or less anybody throughout history. So I don't think there's any reason why, so I don't think there's any reason beyond expectations of the medium that games shouldn't be cooperative, or at least not competitive in the way that they are typically. There's no reason why you can't have players with entirely different objectives. And there may be some overlap. Some of these objectives may be mutually exclusive, but we shouldn't by default have players as rivals, I think. And yeah, I think Daniel's absolutely right. I think because of the way games are set up along these lines of victory, absolutely any moral issues kind of have to take second fiddle to how it damages the player's ability to win.
Okay, thank you. Then we have what would be a good way to represent the conflict and clashing objectives of the leaders during the Crusades, rather than the single-minded armies of hundreds of thousands with one single objective that occurred in the Crusader Kings games? I think this is partly already covered by what you just said. It overlaps a little bit with the other one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose taking this down a little bit more of a specific route. It's basically modeling the behavior of vast numbers of actors. So traditionally, this is done through, traditionally this is done through chance, through entirely random, arbitrary decisions. So I know Luca, I know you and Dick Gordon have been working a lot on representations of the Middle Ages through board games, the Crusades in particular, or of particular relevance here. I know a lot of the events within these games, they're decided by the roll of the dice. And we're getting to the point now where it's possible to model the desires of, well, maybe not every individual, well, certainly not every individual on the crusade, but of a fairly substantial numbers of groups involved in a crusade. So we can have the desires of perhaps, I don't know, perhaps a number of knights from France mapped against the desires of a number of knights from Germany, and just see how these interact through play. I suppose ultimately the alternative is to get together a sufficiently large number of historians, assign them each a character to play, and run through one of Luca's or Gordon's games to see what happens.
A nice mega game organized by Gordon. That would be fun. Paul is asking, most of the warfare depicted in these games is the high-intensity warfare of great kingdom forging battles and sieges. Should more be done to depict the low-intensity raids and skirmishes that were such an important part of medieval warfare? And I would say the great majority of medieval warfare is low-intensity one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose, yeah, so I suppose I should probably qualify this with, it depends what you want the game to do. But I think, yeah, certainly this emphasis on low intensity raids and skirmishes. So yeah, small groups of fighters as opposed to these massive armies can be incredibly interesting. And I suppose, yeah, go back to Mount and Blade for this. I'm not sure how many of you have played the game, but essentially it started off life as a first-person shooter in a pseudo-medieval world where you led a small band of mercenaries, typically no more than 100 troops, and you fought other bands of mercenaries and bandits and forces of rival kingdoms. But from there it developed into, well, first of all, a game where you could play as a knight within one of these kingdoms. So you'd be assigned a village or a castle or eventually a city. And you'd have to rule your domain through the first person perspective. And it was an incredibly interesting break from the more traditional forms of rulership within strategy games, because it's all first person. If you want to see what's going on around the map, you have to physically get close to the map. And all of a sudden, these low intensity raids, these small groups of bandits coming and sacking your village become vitally important. And it gives you a bit of, it gives you a very different insight into what warfare in the Middle Ages looked like. So at the same time, I should also point out I've spent most of this week teaching about Italy in the early 10th century, and a number of surprisingly important battles with people getting captured and killed unexpectedly. But yeah, by and large, definitely low intensity all the way.
Yes, and when I think about low intensity warfare, immediately 𝐩𝐸𝐬𝐿 ibn Munqidh's memoir springs to my mind, which is incredibly interesting to study the Middle East in the 12th century, but there is not even a single great battle. It's all the warfare, and it took part in a lot of warfare. It was all low intensity raids against neighbors, being Muslim or Christian. Another question is, I find the representation of pre-modern, pre-national institutions in games to be often quite problematic. Do you think games like 𝐄𝐯𝐞𝐧𝐭 are improving the representation of medieval political institutions? So I guess Crusader Kings 2 and 3. In general, what can be done to improve further representation of things like borders, conquest, city, castles, countryside, relationships, etc.?
Yeah, no, thanks, Francesco. There's a couple of things there to address, aren't there? I do think the more complex representation of medieval society and politics within Crusader Kings 2 and 3 certainly very useful as a way of exploring the period, exploring these issues. And yeah, I very much agree with you. So this typical presentation of medieval kingdoms as essentially being exactly the same as modern day nation states is, it's fraught with all manner of difficulties. And after you dig into it, it's not just about hair splitting. I think to improve this further, I think we need to counter the main issue with Crusader Kings 2 and 3, and that's the fact they're so complicated, and the learning curve is ridiculous. I feel like I've clocked up, well, for various reasons, I've clocked up must be over 1,000 hours on these games, and I'm relatively certain I've spent about that long figuring out what's going on with the mechanics within them. And I think the way forward, or a way forward, could be smaller games. So focusing on a single kingdom, or even a single county, a single small region within Europe, or indeed anywhere across the medieval world, and really digging down, looking at the interactions between individual key figures within a region. And I suppose the simplification, it's got a number of advantages. So first of all, it's easier to get to grips with playing it. It's easier to see what's going on. So from an educational point of view, it's incredibly useful that way. For a research point of view, likewise. But yeah, I think that it's also, it will allow more interesting exploration of these issues. And yeah, absolutely, I agree with the problem with like these stark borders, these stark boundaries, which a lot of these games present, that can very easily distract from what's going on in the Middle Ages. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, Francesco, but I hope that helps.
So sorry for the noise, but my son just entered the room again. So the idea of the experience of civilians in war, this is William Hubert mentioned how it was covered by David Wesley Bronstein Games in the late 1960s for at least for the Napoleonic conflicts. Apologies for the noises. I think my sons are back from school or nursery. Matt is asking, Crusader Kings 2, albeit to a lesser extent, has elements of dealing with being conquered. I was once the Duke of Thessaloniki and had to convert after being conquered to survive. That's an interesting comment on the previous question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say the other thing. This is it's another thing as well. It's this focus on winning, but I think some of the most interesting games, some of the most interesting strategy games I've played have been the ones which let me lose. So yeah, playing as Byzantium towards the end of the Middle Ages when you're already surrounded by the Ottomans, and knowing that it's inevitably going to end, but just holding out for as long as possible can be just as rewarding as conquering the world, I feel. But sorry.
Yes, it depends from the objectives. Sorry, a little invasion of the room by kids. Boys, could you please get out?
Oh, no. It's okay. It's fine.
Sorry about that. So we reached the end of the questions. I was thinking that one of the things I particularly enjoyed of your talk, Rob, was the fact that you were considering different point of views, not only that of an academic, but also that of a gamer, and the point of view of the developers as well, because it's always fundamental to keep in mind the limitation of the medium itself. So it's quite good to see, to keep in mind, what the point of view of the developers themselves, and the fact that we are, especially for big commercial games, there is the economic aspect as well. I mean, we academics could complain about the representation of certain historical themes, but perhaps if the game was too academic, I mean, the point of view and the interests of the developers does not necessarily, and often does not, coincide with that of an academic.
No, absolutely. Yeah, so we obviously we have different goals in writing and creating, and I suppose I suppose interacting with game developers, trying to make games more historical, is just finding the common ground, which is sometimes frustrating, but often surprisingly easy, as it turns out.
Yes, also it depends what kind of games you're dealing with, especially if games need to be big, video games that need to earn millions of pounds or dollars. Probably they want to reach a wider audience. So while perhaps smaller projects can try to be a little bit more experimental, shall I say?
Yeah, no, it's become a recurring refrain. But small independent games will save the world.
Well, yes, they can. Yes, they can experiment. They can experiment more. They got more flexibility. There is one last question: if Crusader Kings could set parameters for a realistic crusade-like event, what would you want the player to take mainly from it? It's from Gordon.
Okay. So again, with the caveat, it would depend what you're trying to achieve. But personally, I want it to reflect the reality of the Crusades, to reflect some of to reflect, well, first of all, why people went in the first place. If they're crusading under duress, whether it's because of their personal or their perceptions of their personal sins, or if they've been pressured because of society's expectations of them, and of all the events that happen en route to the Holy Land, all the hardships they'd endure, and indeed all the atrocities that they may see or may indeed participate in. So I suppose ideally for me, we're looking at something that does the depth of emotion we see in Dante's Inferno, but within a strategy game. And I think that's potentially a big ask for a mainstream commercial game, but I think we're quietly edging towards that being a possibility as games are getting a bit more mature, really.
Right. And I think that is a very good conclusion, a very good question to last questions. A question. While I was saying that, this is the new one has come up. Probably that you have to take this as the last one. So almost like events happening during the Crusade that affect the reward or opinions you can have.
Oh, Yes, absolutely. I think again, it's leaning more heavily on the role-playing aspects of the game. So yeah, it's really getting the player to see the Crusaders more than just a way of grabbing some land, of gaining some points, of gaining the advantage over their rivals, but seeing it on a much more personal level. And I've got various ideas about how to go about that within games in general, but I'm aware I've taken up a lot of everyone's time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert.